was still commanding David's army, and he was fighting against the Ammonites. He sent word to David to come and help. Remember, we're hearing about how David had stayed back and wasn't involved in the fighting. And he sent word to David to come and help, saying that if David didn't come and help, and he, Joab, took the city on his own, he, Joab, would name the city after himself. Now that doesn't sound too good to the king, so he wasn't going to let that happen. There's no explanation, by the way, of this political power play. But I wonder, and this is just me wondering, if Joab wasn't pretty upset with David for making him a part of the plot to take out Uriah, actually setting up Joab to do the dirty work of David. That's just my wondering, and I'll never know for sure because the Bible doesn't tell us. But the biblical record is that David responded to Joab's threat, and he played to his strength as a military commander, taking charge of the operation himself. Once again, as so many times previously for David, David was victorious over his enemies. He had another military victory. Now what follows after that is one of the really ugly biblical episodes. I won't ask you to count the broken commandments this time again, but as you'll hear, there were several. David had several wives. He also had several concubines, and there were numerous children of those various liaisons. Amnon was the oldest son. He had the hots for his half-sister, Tamar. I told you this was going to kind of get a little bit racy. Tamar happened to be the sister of Absalom. Amnon lusted after Tamar for a while, and then with the aid and encouragement of his friend Jonadab, hatched a plan to trick her into coming into his room so he could, as they say, have his way with her. Amnon even figured out how to get his father David to help without knowing it. How to get David to help in executing the plan. Now, in a way, it's kind of like the apple not falling far from the tree, isn't it? With David and some of his shenanigans, getting other people to do the dirty work and all of that. In a way, it's not. It makes some sense that this would happen. Well, what happened is that Amnon took to his bed pretending to be dreadfully sick. And he waited for David to hear that he was so sick and to come and visit him, which David did. David asked his son, Amnon, his oldest son, "How can I help you?" And Amnon said, "You know, I'd feel so much better if Tamar would come to my room and bring me some food." Why David fell for that silly ploy is beyond me in a royal household full of cooks and servants. But for whatever reason, he did fall for it, and he sent Tamar to prepare food for Amnon. Tamar went, as her father commanded her, and prepared the food for Amnon. Amnon then said he couldn't eat with all of those people around in his rooms while he was sick, and so he dismissed the servants and everybody else who was in the room, except Tamar. And as soon as everyone but Tamar had left the room, Amnon's health and energy were miraculously restored, and he told her what he really wanted. She protested vigorously, saying that he would ruin her life and also ruin his reputation by doing this. But he was much stronger than she and meant to do what he meant to do. And since she wasn't willing to accommodate him, he raped her. Then just as quickly, he rejected her. He kicked her out of his rooms, told the servant to bolt the door, not allow her to come back into the room. Outside, Tamar ripped her robe and put ashes on her head, the traditional signs of mourning. She was mourning something pretty significant. She didn't know where to go. She was no longer one of the king's virgin daughters, so she couldn't go home where the king's virgin daughters stayed, and so she went to her brother Absalom, not knowing where else to go. Absalom took her in and gave her a room in his house. He urged her to forget about it, to put it behind her, which is nice advice, but of course was easier said than done after this traumatic thing had just happened to her. Did David hear about what happened? You bet he did. Well, what did he do? Well, sad to say, he did nothing. David did absolutely nothing about what had happened. Scripture says that David was reluctant to punish Amnon because he loved him. Perhaps he was thinking that he didn't want to ruin Amnon's chances for succession to the throne. After all, he was the oldest son. And there is the ugly reality of that time that sons were more important than daughters, that men were more valuable than women. David's loyalty was to his son, and he seems to, at least at that moment, have forgotten that Tamar was his daughter. Though Absalom urged Tamar to move on and forget it, Absalom, didn't forget it himself. He stewed and fretted about it for a long time. Maybe he couldn't forget about it because, after all, his sister Tamar was in his house, walking around and looking like the ruined woman that she was. She was his sister. For 2 years, he stewed and he pondered, and finally, he decided to take action. So he told his servants, "Go and kill Amnon in revenge for what Amnon has done to Tamar." The truth is that it didn't really help Tamar to have that happen, but it was sweet revenge for Absalom, except for one small problem. It made him a refugee on the run from his father David. Remember, David had more or less protected Amnon after all of this had happened. And so David actually had lost 2 sons at that point. Amnon, his crown prince, though he had protected him, it really wasn't the same because of what he had done. As Tamar had said, it really did ruin his reputation. He had lost him, and now he lost Absalom, who was on the run. Remember what Nathan told David? That there would be trouble from within his own house? It's true, isn't it? Yeah, there was trouble within his own house. At this point, Joab came front and center again. Joab was important as the military commander, and it was important for the kingdom to get back on track. And so as military commander, this mattered a lot to Joab. He didn't care so much about justice as stability, and he was trying to get stability, so what he did was to go to the town of Tekoa to seek out a woman well known for wisdom. They needed some wisdom, and try to get someone to intervene with David. In much the same way that Nathan had engaged David with a story to point out his error to Bathsheba, this woman went to David and told another story, an elaborate story about her 2 sons. She told him that they had fought, and that one of them had been killed, and that relatives wanted revenge, and that killing the other son then would leave her with no sons at all, so that didn't seem like a great idea. Once again, David was drawn into the story, just like he had been when Nathan told the story. And he said basically something my mom used to say, which is 2 wrongs don't make a right. Anybody ever heard that one? 2 wrongs don't make a right, if you wanted to retaliate to somebody. Basically, David said then revenge requires more revenge always, and the cycle never stops. And so he told the woman, "Tell your relatives to settle down, and that if they hurt your son, they'll answer to me." Once again, David was convicted by his own words. The wise woman told him that he was right about her situation, but that he should live by his own reasoning and bring his own son, Absalom, back to the house. David asked if Joab sent her, and she admitted, yep, he had done that. And then he agreed, and he brought Absalom back home. Well, it should have been a happy ending, but you know, it never really worked out. The damage had been done. David had never been much of a father to his sons, and so there wasn't that much of a relationship to repair. It hadn't been a great relationship to start with. There was tension between them. It was evident to everyone. And soon enough, Absalom was plotting to take his father's throne. He became very popular with the people. Scripture says he was a real hunk. He was extremely good looking. He had an absolutely gorgeous head of hair. Remember how we heard in David's younger days that he was very good looking also? It does seem to keep coming around, doesn't it? He made a lot of public appearances, Absalom did, standing at the city gate, shaking hands, greeting people. I don't know if he was kissing babies, but it seemed kind of like an election cycle and what he was doing. He was making it clear that things would run better if he was in charge than it did with his father. 4 years after returning to Jerusalem at his father's request, Absalom made his move. He visited nearby Hebron and declared himself king. And now the fat was in the fire. A messenger told David that Absalom had the hearts of the people. David could see the writing on the wall, and so he actually fled the city. He fled the seat of his kingdom, running for his life from his own son. Nathan said there would be trouble from within his house. Lots of folks still love David, by the way. They wept alongside of the road as he left the city. David, too, was still capable of his own political intrigue as he had been in the past, and so he planted advisors in Absalom's camp and managed to outflank Absalom. And that's where our scripture reading today picked up. So there was all that history in between, that kind of ugly history. And so we hear that Absalom's head got stuck in an oak tree and his mule kept going, leaving him hanging. Now, if the situation hadn't turned out like it did, it would have been a comical image, don't you think? I mean, the fact that he was hanging there and the mule kept going, and you can kind of, it could be a comical thing, but not so much. As it was, Joab sent his men to finish poor Absalom off, despite David's instruction to deal gently with his son. They didn't deal gently, they just killed him. When David heard of the death of his son, despite the fact that there had been a military victory, that he had maintained his leadership of the kingdom, he greatly mourned the loss of his son. Instead of celebrating a victory, David mourned a loss. That's a long, sordid, and messy tale, isn't it? Anybody longing for the simple days of David's youth? Remember those stories, soothing a troubled Saul with music? Slaying a giant to the cheers of lots of people, dancing into Jerusalem, remember that part? It all seems like ancient history now, doesn't it? Things went from bad to worse for David. The things that happened to him weren't good, and the things he made happen and allowed to happen weren't any better, maybe even worse. It's usually true that we learn more from failure than success, isn't it? So there ought to be some powerful lessons here. So let me suggest two.